Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 27. I'm pleased to have back with me this week, Nicole Florisi. If you're not yet familiar with Nicole and the work she does, have a listen to episodes 14 and 15. I think you'll have a quick realization as to why I wanted to have Nicole back on my show. She's a wealth of information on trauma and the impact of trauma on our daily lives, as well as the many different paths to recovery and surviving. Nicole speaks from an abundance of experiential and educational sources, having been a police officer, a shelter director, a therapist, and an exceptional instructor, to name just a few of her vast qualifications. But her passion and zealous spirit is a testament to her sincere desire to help people, and it comes out in an exceptionally personal and down-to-earth way that makes listening to her a true joy. Take a listen and you'll hear what I mean. It's an honor having her back. Here's Nicole. Nicole Florisi, thank you so much for being back with me here on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories.
And thank you again for the invite. I really enjoyed participating last time with one of my colleagues, and I'm very grateful for you re-inviting me to this. So thank you, Dave.
Yeah, it's great. I just think you have so much insight and so much to offer anyone who's been through trauma, especially like this program is directed to sexual assault and rape survivors. But trauma is intricate. Trauma is very complex, and it's different for everyone. And so I think the things you have to say, somebody's going to get something out of it, whether they are a victim of sexual assault or rape, or even the stuff that you are much more involved in, which is trauma response in a law enforcement force situation. And by the way, congratulations on your full-time position with Force Science.
Thank you. I've been very grateful for some of the opportunities that I've been given, and I really enjoy working for Force Science. I've been working with them for the past few years in a part-time capacity, teaching and de-escalation, because I'm also a big fan of communication in our world as one of our best tools all around. So I'm just very blessed to have the opportunity to move forward full-time with them, even though before I was working for VirTra, and I just love VirTra and what they do. And I love working in the training environment for law enforcement. So I will miss that aspect for sure, but I've built some great relationships. So, you can leave an organization and still have the benefit of all those great relationships that you've developed. So I'm really lucky in that aspect.
And then is there a possibility that those associations from VirTra might cross with Force Science in terms of trainings?
We actually already do some fantastic work together.
Okay.
In the simulator itself at VirTra. We have basically like a human factors module and lesson plan that's already integrated basically for like a force encounters type learning environment. So that's already in the simulator. We released a 2-hour de-escalation class in partnership with Force Science. I would consider it a 2-hour foundational. What do you need to know to take away? We have already a fantastic partnership. I'm just lucky. I feel like I get the best of all worlds. I've been looking into with a colleague of mine, Dr. Robbie Adler-Tapia. She had written a book for first responders called One Badge, One Brain, One Life. And she is a trauma psychologist and therapist. To me, it would be necessary reading for everybody in the first responder world. She dials everything down. This is not like an academia above your head type book. This is a real discussion about trauma and stress, prevention, mitigation, skills to also prevent and mitigate what that looks like. Probably the best book I've ever read. We were having a discussion about using the simulator in reintegration after critical incidents. And some agencies already do that. But what I would like to do is to get a committee of first responder trauma psychologists and trainers and basically develop a best practice for use of the simulator for reintegration. So one, we're not inadvertently re-traumatizing someone. We're not turning it into exposure therapy where they're just becoming desensitized to an event like gunfire, where it's actually an integrative process as part of the healing process. That's a fairly new conversation, but I'm hoping in the future we can move forward with that together. Just we can have a recommendation for those who do have a simulator to say, hey, this is a best practice for reintegration, to work with your officers, because the simulator covers so much area. It's use of force, it's communication, it's de-escalation. And it's the most important thing that we do, really any human being when you think about it, but especially in law enforcement, about decision-making. What is decision-making? And then what is decision-making under stress? I think future focused, I'm hoping we can move forward with something like that. Obviously, from speaking to me in the past, my focus really is, it's beyond mitigation of trauma and first responders. My goal would be prevention. It's prevention. There's not enough talk, as far as I'm concerned, about the prevention of post-traumatic stress. And we can prevent it. There's ways to do that. There's ways to give people skills and tools to work through things. And, that's just a discussion that hopefully, even though there's so much growth and there's so much talk, and there are some leaders out there who are really just charging that parade down, talking about this. But what I want is we need to do more than talk. We need to walk this walk. We need to be having comfortable conversations where this integration of the skills goes across everywhere. And so I, of course, want to be part of that. But we have to have the discussion. It is first responders, it is EMS personnel, it is therapists, it is psychologists, and it is every other human being who has had the experience, whatever that may be for them. That's a big conversation far past. And you hit on that with this podcast, because where does a great deal of trauma occur? And that's in sexual assault, physical abuse, sexual abuse, your sex trafficking, your human trafficking. And so you kind of have the niche to be able to talk that message. And to the forgotten population, I think, is the people who work sexual assault. We don't tend to see the trauma support for domestic violence advocates and the people who work in the shelter and sanctuary environments. That vicarious trauma is very similar to what a therapist or a psychologist is going to experience.
Sure. And I think people need to hear that from you, but also the aspect that vicarious trauma is there, but it's also cumulative, just like any other kind of trauma.
Yes.
You don't just say, okay, yeah, I'm exposed to trauma victims day in, day out as a therapist or as a victim advocate, interpersonal violence advocate, but I see this every day. And so, yes, unless you're taking care of yourself and doing things that help kind of alleviate that buildup, it is going to have a severe impact. I mean, that's what burnout is all about. That's what depression comes from for those who are in the field for a long period of time.
You're right. It's just such a challenge I just think it's a forgotten population. I really do. People who are working in that environment. And I don't think it's purposeful, but the focus tends to be on, and as it should be, first responders who work that type of event, whether it's the medical, also medical field, doctors, ER, like whatever that looks like, seeing those things. The victim advocates who are on the ground level, who are the support for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence and, whatever role they fill, whether it's through a shelter, whether it's through a law enforcement, like a grant funded job to support victims, that's their whole world. That is minimum of 40 hours a week of exposure to that. And that can be, if somebody doesn't come to the table with a set of coping and resiliency skills, it's just a population that I think gets overlooked, and they tend not to even really be invited to the table for the conversation. I know when I was running that domestic violence and sexual assault center, that was one thing that was very noticeable to me, was what kind of skills are we giving to our advocates and our support personnel so they don't take this home? We need to be part of that conversation. And actually, that's probably one of the best things about getting to talk on this podcast is it's a reminder to include them in those conversations and to help them have those same skill sets and teach them those skill sets and not overlook, because let's be honest, you and I both know this, advocacy work is crap pay. This is not your top tier. Nobody's making, a fantastic living. They're doing it most of the time. This is driven to help people. It is driven from a compassionate lens. It may be driven from a previous experience and them wanting to have the support maybe they didn't get when they were going through it. And people are making, a lot of times, let's be honest, less than $20 an hour with this work that is very overwhelming. And part of the onboarding process is not usually, I won't say never, but it's not usually about, hey, what can we do to support you so you don't take this home to your family?
Right. Very little of that from the advocacy aspect of it, but even from our previous law enforcement backgrounds, I don't recall much of there being any sort of vicarious trauma self-care offering from the employer.
Yeah. And I think we're getting better, but I'm just going to be, this is Nicole's opinion, but better is not good enough. It's still not good enough.
Yeah.
If we would be doing better across the board, and let's include, military in this,
Yep.
all the education we've been doing and all the studies we've been doing and everything that we do when it comes to post-traumatic stress, brain injuries, whatever that looks like, the suicide rate's not going down. All the talk we do, mental health problems are still on the rise overall. Suicide is not dropping. So talking is not good enough. It is, how can we support people with the appropriate integration where they don't feel they're just a number? They don't feel like they're a guinea pig with their psychiatrist or whomever is potentially prescribing their medication, where, the next new thing's coming out the door of the pharmacy for a psychiatric med. And, oh, we want to try this now, not allowing that person any amount of stabilization. I mean, there's so many layers to this conversation, but if talking fixed this problem, we wouldn't have had any more suicide.
Right.
It continues to grow in the military world, or at minimum, stay static in the numbers, the same in the first responder world. And although I'll be honest, I don't know the percentages in psychologists and therapists, I can't imagine that's gone down either. I could be wrong, but if it follows the other curves, we're not, right? Yeah. We're continuing to go up in that. And so if it's going to go up in populations we're attempting to help, what is it like in the populations that are overlooked?
Let's talk about that a little bit. You mentioned previously that the prevention aspect of this is critical and hasn't been addressed nearly like it should, without getting really, really deep in the weeds, which I know you could because you've got that education, you've got that vision. I'm just curious, explain to our listeners, if you would, what that prevention picture looks like in terms of eliminating post-traumatic stress.
First off, we do have to have individual buy-in. Let's admit that. The person on the receiving end of this vicarious trauma does have to agree to engage in these skills. If we want to excel in our craft, whatever that is, and I look at that in military, law enforcement, psychology, psychiatry, trauma, advocacy, it needs to be okay that people go to therapy and accepted that it's okay. We're still stigmatized for it. If you want to be at the top of your game, whatever your role is, you have to be a finely honed weapon to do that. And the talk needs to be, if you are a knight, you go to your blacksmith, right? You're a swordsmith, you hone that weapon. Going to therapy is part of honing that weapon. It needs to be accepted that for you to be at the top of your game, you are okay with the conversations about going to therapy and finding the right type of therapist for you, and having someone who isn't your family, isn't your friend, someone that is in a more objective role that you can hone those skills and be able to actually free your mind. All the skills that accompany that, grounding techniques and mindfulness meditation and breathing techniques, it has to be a bigger conversation than let's talk about doing them, let's do them. Even when I teach, regardless of what role, wherever I put on a class, let's admittedly say first responders can be a little more difficult of a population to buy into doing any kind of mindfulness. And that can be hard for a trainer who maybe is less comfortable with that conversation and say, hey, I want to teach you some grounding techniques. I want to teach you mindfulness. I want to integrate that. I would literally have no problem. I could be in a paid role to teach a class. But if the trainer who just took my class is uncomfortable, says, you know what, I don't feel like I maybe have the right connection with my people, or I'm just not comfortable with the emotional side of things yet, then I would literally come in on a Zoom meeting and say, I will teach your people myself. I will teach them the techniques, and we can do it together through a Zoom meeting. Or if I get the opportunity, I'd love to do it in person, because we have to integrate and we have to normalize that these coping skills and these resiliency skills are absolutely important. The base level, they're okay to do. And they're okay to do in front of your coworkers, and they're okay to do in front of somebody else. They're okay to teach to other people. In Nicole's perfect world, this stuff would be taught from kindergarten up. What we lack in the world is basically challenges in self-regulation of emotion. I mean, at minimum. And we live in interesting times, and lack of self-regulation of any emotional components it's out there. I mean, that's what's going on. It's
magnified right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So step one has to be the comfort level of the individual, whether it's the trainer, practicing those skills, being comfortable enough to do those skills with their people. You know, in the role of a therapist, I don't let the client leave my office without teaching them the skill, and we do it together, right? We do it together. I teach them breathing techniques, and I teach them tapping, and I teach them mindfulness techniques and grounding, and we do it together. Now, it is incumbent upon them, once they leave that environment, to do them themselves. I can only encourage them to do that. So there is part of that, initial self-responsibility that, the individual has to do them. But if it's not normalized and it's not, and the culture doesn't support that it's okay, it's less likely that you're going to see people doing those or right. But if that's not normalized within the culture, it's just an uphill battle. In the law enforcement world, the challenge comes in. Trainers have, if you don't have buy-in from trainers, it's a tough road, because then how do you allow the scenario-based training for integration? But to me, that's no different than advocacy work. Instead of, hey, you should box breathe, or hey, you should meditate. Hey, let's talk about how do we do those skills together? And, where I was working, we did that. That was one of the things I implemented. I also implemented that staff could attend. We would do basically like yoga style meditation. And I provided that for staff, because while clients need that, so does staff.
Right.
They need to be able to ground, and they need to be able to have exposure so they don't get burnout. Because without the people working to support our clients who have those experiences of sexual assault and domestic violence, where are we if we don't have any workers? Who's left to support them? And so this is a multifaceted and multi-layered issue that support needs to be for, let's admittedly say, for everyone, right?
Yeah. It changes everything in terms of long-term response if you are taking care of yourself that way.
Right. And admittedly, all human beings deserve it. No one deserves to live in a suffering mindset. You know what I mean? But the population that we are talking about right here are sexual assault, domestic violence victims, those who are advocates who work in that field, first responders, doctors, therapists. The higher you go up that chain, also, no one deserves to suffer there either. And, when I look at first responder and military work, of course, I probably mentioned this on the last podcast, but to me, there's no more sacred calling than military or first responder work. There really isn't. To give your life for another person. What you don't deserve at the end of your career or in any part of your career is to be suffering, depression, relationship problems, substance abuse problems, suicidal ideation, and then potentially the end result of completion of suicide. While no human being deserves to have to suffer any experience that leads to that, first responders, in my mind, and military, absolutely do not, because of that calling. It's a sacred calling. I'm very frustrated when I hear, well, they chose that job. And you know what? Kudos to them for choosing that job. But that doesn't mean by proxy of your job, you deserve to suffer. That is absolutely not on the table. And that is a very frustrating point to me. Even like a year ago, I had something come in my lap where I referred out, but it was basically an officer. Now, admittedly, I think we can all agree first responders do have cumulative trauma. They may have an overwhelming event, and we're going to talk about one of those, but we do get exposed to cumulative stressors and trauma our career. That, not just at work, there's the stuff at home. But this officer, in his role, he had to go to a house fire where there were some burned bodies. That can sometimes be the tipping point, right? So in this case, for that officer on his journey, that was for him, that was the tipping point. It was that burned body and that visual image and those odors associated with that. And he chose to, medical out at that point because he was struggling. He is still on his healing journey, and that's great. But his department was like, yeah, that's just part of your job. Basically, get over it. And we're not going to recognize post-traumatic stress. We're not going to recognize these overwhelming events. Like, this is what you signed up to do. So get over it. This isn't 20 years ago. This isn't 30 years ago. This is last year. And that mindset is still pervasive of law enforcement.
Yeah.
And you don't get to pick another person's overwhelming trauma because maybe you're okay with a burned body. Maybe that wouldn't be what it is for you. Right. But there's always something that can potentially be the tipping point. Our lack of recognition and trauma blindness in first responder work, it's kind of appalling with all the research that's out there at this point. And to just say that's your job, we should celebrate people who take these difficult jobs, advocates that everyday work with that, people who work in human and sex trafficking centers. Anybody who takes a first responder job, those who choose lines of therapy, crisis therapy, high suicidality clients, stuff like that. But because you had enough internal fortitude to take the job, doesn't mean that you should have to suffer. And that, I'll be honest, like the human part of me is like, you've got to be kidding. And you can fill in the blank with a lot of stuff, I think, when it comes to that, right? But that is beyond unfair. And we know life isn't fair. That's not right. That is absolutely not right.
It's not right. And especially as you talked very plainly about There's tons of research out there that says this happens. There's ways to deal with it, and ignoring it isn't the best way to deal with it. And that's what's happening. And that's the frustration.
Yeah, it's frustrating,
Let me
and
change.
you see it in your role. And,
Yeah.
And the thing is, I think that is pervasive in sexual assault survivors as well, and domestic violence victims. You should be over it by now, right? How many times you chose to stay? God, if I hear that one more time,
Right.
okay, that is a lot more complex in a multi-layered event than choosing to stay, as you know, in a relationship of some kind that has abuse attached to it. You chose to stay, so you deserve it.
I had two guests that fell right into that category recently, one male, one female, and they were in relationships that were abusive, assaultive, rape oriented. And yeah, because of circumstances, they didn't get out right away.
Right.
And you're absolutely right.
And they need support.
Why should they be blamed?
Exactly. Victim blaming is a bunch of crap. I mean, let's admit that, that's not appropriate. And it does nothing to support the victim in any future moves that they make. But
it's also, Nicole, one of the big, huge reasons out there that it is so stigmatized and victims are so afraid to talk is because of that very reason that we're talking about, is victim blaming and the fear to talk about it. My last guest, Alan Manwaring, and I had kind of a pretty good discussion about that very thing. What if the gentleman you had just referred to hadn't said anything about seeing those burned bodies and having that be the tipping point, but instead pushed on through and took that cumulative trauma and that pushing point further,
right,
and tried to continue and didn't make that realization consequence known to other people and therefore kept doing what he was doing? There's consequences to that too, that impact the employer and the people that were out there trying to serve as first responders. We're ignoring that.
Having the strength to actually admit it, like saying, I recognize this is impacting me. It's hurting me. It is hurting my mental health. And that will also be hurting your physical health. It's all tied together, right? To actually be strong enough to admit it, and then to be marginalized by your employer, potentially marginalized by your coworkers, because admittedly, this isn't just a high leadership or high management issue. People do bring their own individual beliefs to the table, just like they do in all walks of life. You still hear people marginalizing sexual assault victims. Well, you were in the wrong part of town. You shouldn't have been wearing that. You shouldn't have been out at 2 a.m. in this area. No. The problem is the perpetrator's behavior. It is absolutely on the perpetrator. It is not on the victim/survivor. Let's admit how many failings there are there. I mean, the court system fails us in this. What about when there's a domestic violence relationship with shared children and the judge dad still has to see the kids? Sometimes, even if there's a restraining order, it'll be except for when the kids are dropped off. I worked with a client for some amount of time who every time the kids got dropped off, he raped her in front of the children. And if she didn't go, she would get put in jail for violating the court order. I mean, there's so many failures of systems when it comes to this that it boggles your mind when you really start to look at it. Everybody's personal biases shows through. I remember when I was working at running the domestic violence shelter and sexual assault center, a staff member had commented offhandedly at Christmas time, because we were very blessed to have some fantastic donors, very robust people would donate all sorts of money, presents, gift cards, and tried to meet the needs of the people who were at our shelter. We were a 28-bed facility. We would have these fantastic donors who are like, hey, we want them to experience like the best Christmas they've ever had, if we can be part of that, like the safest, best Christmas. And one of my staff members offhandedly said, wow, just get to stay here and get all your stuff for free for Christmas. I pulled him aside and I said, for free? I said, if you think every time somebody is raped or hit or abused or belittled, I said, you think that's free? I said, you might want to reflect on if this job is for you. Because I was appalled at that. And then, you have that mindset, unfortunately, sometimes in staff members that work there. People bring their own personal biases, but I just couldn't wrap my head around that statement.
Yeah. And that bleeds over to the victims.
You bet it does.
There to serve. Absolutely.
You bet it does. So, I can definitely say, sometimes you think you've seen it all, and then your bubble even gets burst more. when you hear that kind of stuff. Yeah. So that was a challenge. But then you think about, these are the people that are supposed to be supporting. Even when I first started there, I remember, well, if they're going back to their perpetrator, they don't need us. If they're going back to their perpetrator, they need us perhaps equally, if not more than other, right? I said, because they're in an extremely unsafe environment, extremely unsafe, and trying to perhaps get to the point where where they feel it's safe enough to leave, whatever that is for them. We don't get to pick it. They have to pick that, right? We can only be supportive and safety plan and do everything we need to do to be there for them as we can. But that mindset, if people aren't exposed to the realities of these type of relationships with coercive control and predominant aggressors, and where people are using sex and beyond that, trauma bonding, and what those relationships are like, and how admittedly at the end of the day we also don't discuss the known, regardless of how unhealthy it is still better than the unknown, because the unknown is scary. You know what to expect from the perpetrator in your relationship. You know what's going to come.
What do you say to those people out there that are listening that want to talk, like the guy we were just talking about, the burned bodies, and with Alan, he hasn't disclosed everything to the general public about his sexual abuse as a child. He's written it down in great detail, but he only gives that to very, very few close people that he wants to know. This is my history. But to come on my podcast and say, I was raped, he has said that, but he won't talk about the details. He won't talk about the impact that it had on him as a 6th, 7th, 8th grader. But these people do need to talk. It's part of that healing process. What do you say to those people who know they need to, but aren't ready yet, and recognize that they really need to, but don't know where to start?
Well, admittedly, this is where I can start. The skills that we can talk about, let's start with skills before processing for just a second.
Sure.
Right? Maybe if they're not ready to talk to, whether it be a therapist, I'd even say a close friend, but let's talk about moving into the mental health world. You can always start with the skills to help you manage yourself and your thoughts, like those grounding skills. So you don't start ruminating and just become stuck in those environments, like things to help ideally manage or prevent some of that dissociation, and that desensitization of things, those mindfulness skills, those tapping skills, those grounding skills, those things that are helpful. We tend to overlook exercise. I don't know if you saw that recent study that came out. Exercise treats depression better than any clinical psychopharmacology, in general. I mean, there's some great studies on that. There's some great brain hormones when it comes to exercise. We tend to overlook that. So I would say start with the skills, because the challenge is this, and this is going to be for every human being. You may seek therapy and it might not also be the right type of therapist for you. This is another hurdle for all people that are looking. Is it an appropriate vetted therapist that can actually handle what you're bringing to the table? That's the harder conversation, because sometimes, and I see it more in the first responder world than the sexual assault world, they'll realize it's time. Maybe they get sent from work. Maybe it's an EAP, or maybe it's somebody through their insurance. It's not a cash pay, right? Because that can also be a smidge expensive. And they go talk to the person, and the person's like, I need you to stop talking. Like, I can't handle your trauma. I mean, that's a reality. And
so much reality.
So, the thing is, I think one thing is any person has to take the time to research their therapists and psychologists that they're going to go to with recommendations of what does that look like? Like, can they handle trauma? What are they trained in? Are they looking for EMDR? Are they looking for skills? Also understanding that they have control to a degree over their therapy. If they go to therapy, I'm not ready to talk yet. Nobody should be forcing you to talk if you're not ready. But hey, can I support you with skills? While we're building that relationship, while you're learning to trust me, and what that looks like. I mean, because honestly, it's not so simple as just you had alluded to and talked about. It's not so simple as, man, I think I need to talk. I'm going to grab a therapist, because that's not that simple for anybody, But I would say skills are critical, because you have emotions 24 hours a day. You have therapy maybe once a week. So learning those skills, learning techniques, grounding techniques, mindfulness, exercising. And I'm not talking, you got to turn yourself into a world Olympic athlete. Like, are you walking? Are you like playing pickleball? Are you just doing something to get those, a little bit of like homeostasis in the body, driving some of that cortisol out? I mean, people who are constantly in fear and, that acute stress response, like all that stuff's got to go somewhere.
Well, and I'll mention one other, just simple, because it can be that simple. Like you just said, walking around the room, getting up off the couch. I have a staircase in my house, and walking up and down those stairs 4, 5, 6 times does amazing things to your mindset.
Yes. And you can think the same thoughts the same thoughts that you will lie in bed and stare at the ceiling and lose 2 hours of your time, right? You'll dissociate. Those same thoughts, you can sit in a chair and wonder where the last 30 minutes of your life went. If those thoughts are in your head, I get it. But do what you're talking about. Walk up and down those stairs. Go for, like hit the gym for a minute, like get on your treadmill, do something like, to give your brain, it helps your brain settle down. It gives your brain a break rather than, sitting there and ruminating and hyper focusing on that negativity.
Yeah.
So I think that's crucial. I think it's really important to research your therapist. Now, perhaps with financial implications, I understand that is a huge window. And in a lot of community behavioral health, let's admit it, there's not a heck of a lot of EMDR therapists. Obviously, I'm an advocate for EMDR therapy when it comes to trauma. Bilateral processing is incredibly important. So I understand that can be a financial impact if a behavioral health center doesn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also, can you find somebody that does that is vetted, and well-trained? And, you just hit me so hard when you were talking about the gentleman on your podcast. He's also in a different world when you think about this. It is more, I don't want to say more difficult for men, but men are in an odd position when they're reporting sexual assault, even to his credit, to even be able to talk about it. Like, let's admit that, because they're judged differently than women. Women have this sort of criteria and bias that they're judged on. Men are judged very differently.
Sure.
I think I don't want to say harder in the fact of disclosure, but societally, it is a different world for men to come out and report. And gosh, Dave, I worked, it just, when you hear the personal experiences, like it drives you home of, if there's one of these, how many more? Where I worked with a person who said, I don't understand how a man can be raped. I don't understand how a woman could rape a man. I guess I kind of get it if a man can do it, but how does a woman do it? How did you get this job? Now, and I'm not trying to like marginalize, but it's like, holy cow, that is a big disconnect. What if that's the person working my crisis hotline when a guy calls? Most people in the DV and sexual assault world, they tend to have a different comfort level talking to women than to men.
Mm-hmm.
And so men get the raw end of the stick. It doesn't mean that women are treated appropriately or fairly. So I don't want to like set that, but I'm just saying,
I get that.
It's
I know what you're saying.
different for men, and they get looked at very differently. So in the case you were talking about, I can absolutely see why they could admit what happened, but not be ready to talk about the experience in entirety. But one benefit of EMDR is you don't have to talk about anything. That's the benefit of EMDR. You really don't have to, if you're not ready to process and you're not ready to share that verbally, EMDR doesn't require that you say much of anything. You just work on that bilateral processing I just tell people just to help settle your brain. You don't deserve to have that same emotional explosion every time the thoughts accompany it, or to freeze, or potential paralysis or dissociation.
Yeah.
So there's that too.
Yeah. As I understand EMDR, it's a lot of internal processing as the external bilateral exercises are going on. So yes, 100% right. You don't have to talk, or if you do, it's minimal.
Right. And I think especially, some people, that's not their thing. They don't want to talk. And the thing is, we need to acknowledge that and support them and say, that's okay. You don't have to talk to heal. I think that the fallacy, it's the opposite. People think you have to talk to heal. And you're under no requirement to dump that on anybody if you don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
You can, if you choose like certain types of therapy. Now, that's an individual journey. If I'm in that boat and I'm like, I am going to have to talk about this at some point for me to move forward, that's an individual journey. But I think that we kind of put people in this framework where they think they have to. And to me, that's the best part of EMDR is you don't have to. Or if you're not ready to talk, go to a skills-based therapist for a while. Just go to somebody like that is doing, I'm a big fan of DBT, of dialectical behavior therapy. Yes, it was initially designed for borderline personality disorder. That's not the enjoyment of it. The enjoyment is it's very skills-based. It's about stress tolerance. It's about what can I do to manage all this overwhelming stuff. To me, that's huge. So it's about skills. And, that can always be a person's first step. I just need to manage myself a little bit. If they are inclined to take some type of medication, hey, great. They need to be supported on whatever road they are on. If they're like, I'd rather do this without medication, like we as therapists and psychologists and stuff like that, we need to do our best to support clients and meet them where they're at, just like we would any human being. I mean, everybody's an individual,
Yeah.
But obviously, I'm about EMDR therapy because you don't have to process. You don't, I mean, well, you will process, but I mean, you don't have to verbally, do much of anything. And so that's huge for some people. They may never want to utter that person's name again that did it to them. And they should be supported and honored, and they don't have to. I think another thing that impacts sexual assault victims, and this has always been a point of contention with me, is I think it's pushed that they have to forgive people who have done horrible and heinous things to them. And that, I'm going to be honest, like that pisses me off. Oh, Nicole, people have to forgive. No, that's an individual journey. And why do you pick on the people who aren't ready to forgive instead of focusing on what's the actual problem? How about the perpetrator's behavior?
Exactly.
There's no requirement to forgive to heal. And I think we force that upon, and whether it's sexual assault, violent crime, like you name it, right? Oh, you have to forgive somebody. No, by God, you do not. You do absolutely not. If that is for you, then that's for you. And if it's not for you, nobody should be making you feel guilty about it, because it's like they're marginalized for lack of forgiveness again, instead of they didn't do anything and the perpetrator did all these horrible, nobody wants to acknowledge there are such horrible, heinous, awful things that happen to human beings that don't require forgiveness from anybody, unless you're religious, except from God.
And I'm so
right?
glad you said that, because so many of my listeners need to hear that.
Yes, it's whatever that journey is for that person. And
absolutely, 100%.
If forgiveness is part of it, I 100% support that person. But if they're like, I'm not going to forgive that person, then that's fine.
That's fine. You can still heal.
Yes. And that's really the biggest thing. I think any sexual assault survivor, violent crime survivor, the message needs to be, you can absolutely recover. It has to be a message of hope. Your brain can recover. Your brain is hurt, just like potentially in your event, your body was hurt. It took X amount of time for your body to heal. It is going to take X amount of time for your brain to heal, for you to feel, whole in yourself again. And what that looks like, that's going to be a different length of time for everybody. We also need to be like, oh my God, you're never going to get better. Or if you don't get out of this, like, oh my God, you're just screwed. Like the negativity that accompanies, like, honestly, even some of the most well-meaning people, right? Yeah. It's like, no, like you can absolutely recover.
For sure.
You're injured.
And that's the message here. I really am so happy that you brought this all up, because it speaks to the heart of what this podcast is all about. You don't have to be stuck. You don't have to be a victim forever. It's survivor stories. And how you get from victimhood to survivorhood is an individual journey, just like you just said. And there's so many paths.
Yes. And don't judge yourself. And this is the hard part. We're judgy as human beings, including judging ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If you don't think you're healing fast enough, don't judge yourself for that. Your journey is your journey, I mean, and that's really it. No matter how many backsteps you have or backslides, the human experience is moving forward in conjunction with backsliding. It's not always about like the specific negative event. That's just a human experience. And so I think what is really important is just not judge yourself in the fact that somebody's like, you're not over this by now. No, nobody gets to pick how long that takes for you. Nobody gets to pick that for you. This is your experience and your journey. And even people who may have had a similar experience, admittedly, maybe, somebody who was sexually assaulted, they may have a circle of friends or acquaintances who have a similar experience. And I can tell you, if there's 10 people in that group, it'll be 10 different healing experiences, 10 different lengths of time, 10 different, if it's all domestic violence, intimate partner, it'll be 10 different times of leaving. Everything is on the individual. But the judginess from the outside turns to judginess on ourselves. And the reminder just needs to be, hey, I can absolutely recover. This is my journey and I will do it. And I am doing it. And just because you don't feel you've made the progress that you think you should have, doesn't mean you're not making progress. And I think that's huge.
I do too. And I think that's important for everyone to hear, regardless of the background that they have coming to this podcast. So again, thank you. You bring up so many great points.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate the invite. It's always great. And I hope anybody that's out there, you have my contact info. People can always email me with questions, I'll give you some reading material. I mean, But I just want everybody to know that there's hope and they can recover, and just know that there's people out there that you don't know that support you, that support your journey and your healing. And when you're feeling down on yourself, just remember that a lot of people are looking at you and probably looking at you as a role model through your journey, because maybe they're not where you are.
Yeah, for sure. Nicole, when you talk about this kind of stuff and then we stop and you move on from here, from this almost hour that we've been talking, where does your brain go?
Well, wow, that's a deep question there, Dave. Where will my brain go after this? Well, honestly, where my brain goes most of the time when it comes to anything like this, from the work I've done in first responder work, therapy, or sexual assault and domestic violence work, it goes to, I'm grateful that I get to be in this position to be able to do what I can for other people. Honestly, like, I think gratitude is huge. And I think we who are willing to help people just need to remember that when somebody comes to us or somebody reaches out, instead of recoiling away from their experience, we need to look at that as they have given us a gift. They have chosen us that day. And so, like, when I leave these podcasts and I think about this stuff, I'm just reminded about how grateful I am to be able to support anybody through this experience of whatever it is that they choose to share with me, or just to sit in silence with somebody. Because sometimes I get off these and I just like sit for a minute. Like, I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to talk to your audience, and I just hope that they get that and know that there's people that believe in them,
I think we all feel honored by having you here also. Thank you for that. Would you also consider coming back again and being a guest?
Absolutely. You bet. Absolutely. Awesome. I really enjoy this. I think you are pushing out a very, very important and well-needed message. Like, survivors, one of the things that are taken away from people in sexual assault and violent crime many times is their voice. And you're providing a platform for somebody to regain their voice. And that's huge. And it doesn't matter how little or how much they say, it's still their voice. That's also its own sacred type of calling. It's a craft. You're giving that to people, and that should not be overlooked with how critical that is.
That's one of the main reasons I started this. So thank you for acknowledging that and telling people about that from an outsider's perspective. It is big. It's a huge part of regaining some power. It's having that platform, having that voice. If you want it, it's there. I've had several guests contact me and say, hey, Dave, I just need to tell my story. I just need to talk to you.
That's awesome. And great for them. And for anybody listening who's not ready, that's okay too. Like, sure. You'll tell your story or not tell it in whatever that time is for you, and all of it's okay. That's the thing. All of it's okay. Everybody's healing journey is okay with wherever they're at. And don't compare yourself to anybody else. Just know that you can heal when you're ready.
Nicole, you've taken a big chunk out of your day to spend with us, and I just want to give you my heartfelt thanks and appreciation for your time, your knowledge, your views. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome. And thank you again, Dave. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Great. We'll talk again soon. That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. My deepest appreciation and thanks goes out to Nicole Florisi for coming back to bring us her amazing insights and perspectives. I hope that as you listened to Nicole, you not only learned more about trauma than you ever knew before, but also that you were uplifted and gained a sense of how important you are in whatever capacity you heard this episode. Nicole truly cares about you and is willing to make herself available via email if you have questions or if you just want to say hi and tell her how much you enjoyed listening to her in this episode. Her email address is in the episode notes, as is mine. We'd both appreciate hearing from you. Thank you again for listening to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Your willingness to listen and share this podcast with others is greatly appreciated and is noticeably helping the podcast grow. So thank you again. Keep spreading the word and keep up your efforts to help bring justice to victims and survivors of sexual assault. Besides listening to and sharing this podcast, another great way to do this is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.